The stage robber's mask fell off at the worst possible moment and revealed the face of someone's long-dead husband. She buried him 3 years ago. Watch dirt fall on his empty coffin while rain soaked through her black dress. But when that stagecoach robber's mask tore away in the desert wind, Sarah Mitchell found herself staring into the living eyes of her dead husband. The man she'd mourned. The man she grieved for. The man who had let her believe he was gone forever. In that moment, with the desert sun burning overhead and her heart shattering all over again, Sarah realized that sometimes the cruelest thing isn't death, it's resurrection. This is the story of love, betrayal, and the impossible choice between forgiveness and revenge in the unforgiving American West. The stagecoach rocked like a boat on rough water, but Sarah Mitchell kept her hands folded tight around her Bible. The leather cover was soft from 3 years of desperate prayers, worn smooth by fingers that had learned to grip hope when everything else slipped away. Outside the small window, the desert stretched endless and gold, broken only by the dark shapes of rocks that stood like tombstones under the burning sky. She was 26 now, though she felt older, much older. The other passengers, a merchant with soft hands and a woman wearing too much perfume, talked in low voices about business and weather. Sarah listened, but did not speak. She had learned that words were like water in the desert. You save them for when you truly needed them. The coach bounced hard, and her bag shifted against her feet. Everything she owned was in that bag. 2 dresses, her mother's silver brush, and the deed to a small house in Tucson where she planned to start over. Again, 3 years was long enough to mourn, people said. Long enough to wear black. Long enough to live like a ghost herself. Thomas had been dead 3 years come October. Killed in a mine collapse outside Silver Creek, they told her. His body was never found, lost under tons of rock and earth. She had waited by that pile of stones for 2 days, hoping they were wrong, hoping he would crawl out somehow, dirty but alive, with that crooked smile that made her forget every worry she had ever carried. But he never came out. The stagecoach driver shouted something she could not hear over the sound of wheels and wind. Then the world went wrong all at once. The horses screamed. The coach tilted hard to the left, and Sarah's Bible flew from her hands. The merchant grabbed the window frame, his face going white as flour. The woman in perfume started to pray in a voice high and thin as wire. They stopped so fast that Sarah's head hit the wall. Stars danced behind her eyes, and for a moment she thought she might be dreaming. But the desert heat was real. The taste of dust in her mouth was real. And the voice outside was real too. Everyone out. Slow and easy. Keep your hands where I can see them. Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach like a stone down a well. She had heard stories. Everyone had. Stagecoaches robbed. Passengers left walking in the desert with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some never made it to the next town. The door opened with a creak that sounded too loud in the sudden silence. A man stood there, tall and lean, wearing a dark coat despite the heat. His face was hidden behind a red bandana, but his eyes were visible above the cloth. Blue eyes, the kind of blue she had seen before, though she could not remember where. Out, he said again, and his voice was rough like he had been shouting, though he spoke quiet now. The merchant went first, stumbling as he stepped down. His hands shook as he raised them above his head. The woman followed, still praying under her breath, her perfume mixing with the smell of dust and fear. Sarah came last. Her legs felt weak, but she made them work. She had learned to make her body do what it needed to do, even when her heart wanted to give up. The desert sun hit her like a physical blow, and she blinked against the brightness. There were 3 of them, all masked, all armed. They stood in a half circle around the coach like wolves around a wounded deer. The one who had spoken was clearly their leader. He moved different than the others, sure of himself, but careful too, like a man who had learned that one mistake could mean death. Money, he said, looking from passenger to passenger. Jewelry. Anything worth taking. The merchant reached for his wallet with shaking fingers. The woman fumbled with the clasp on her purse. But Sarah just stood there, her hands empty, staring at the leader's eyes. Those blue eyes that seemed familiar in a way that made her chest tight. "You," he said, pointing at her. "What have you got?" "Nothing much," she said, and her voice sounded steady even though everything inside her was shaking. "Just enough to start over." Something in her words made him pause. He tilted his head like a dog, hearing a sound it recognizes but cannot place. Behind the red cloth, she could see his mouth open slightly, as if he was about to say something. That was when the wind picked up. Desert wind could be gentle, like a whisper across the sand, or it could be fierce, like the breath of an angry god. This wind was neither. It was steady and purposeful, as if it had work to do. It caught the edge of his bandana. He reached up to fix it, but he was too slow. The cloth pulled away from his face like a curtain being drawn back on a stage. And Sarah Mitchell saw the face of her husband. Thomas. Her Thomas. The man she had buried 3 years ago with an empty coffin and a broken heart. The man whose picture sat beside her bed, whose memory she carried like a scar. The man she had loved more than her own life. He stood there in the desert sun, alive and real and wrong in every possible way. His face was thinner than she remembered, weathered by wind and worry. His hair was longer, and there was gray at his temples that had not been there before. But it was him. She would know those eyes anywhere, know the shape of his mouth, the way he held his shoulders when he was afraid. The world tilted. The desert spun around her like water going down a drain. She heard someone make a sound like a wounded animal and realized it was her. "Sarah," he whispered, and his voice was exactly the same. Exactly the same as it had been the morning he kissed her goodbye and rode off to the mine for the last time. The other bandits were looking back and forth between them, confused. The passengers stood frozen, not understanding what was happening, but sensing that something had changed. The wind died down, leaving only silence and the terrible weight of recognition. Sarah's knees gave out. She would have fallen if Thomas had not stepped forward and caught her arm. His touch was real, warm. The same calloused fingers that had once traced her face in the dark before dawn. "You're dead," she said, and the words felt like glass in her throat. He was still holding her arm, and she could see tears starting in his eyes above the bandana that now hung loose around his neck. "Sarah, I can explain. You're dead," she said again, louder this time. "I buried you. I mourned you. I wore black for a year and cried until I had no tears left." The merchant and the woman were backing away slowly, understanding that this was no ordinary robbery. This was something else, something private and terrible and not meant for strangers to witness. Thomas looked at them, then at his companions, then back at Sarah. She could see him struggling, could see the moment when he realized that his old life and his new one had just collided like two trains on the same track. "Go," he said to the other bandits without taking his eyes off Sarah. "Ride out. I'll catch up." "Thomas," one of them started. "Go," he said again, and there was something in his voice that brooked no argument. They went. Sarah heard horses moving away, heard the jingle of spurs and saddles, but it all seemed to come from very far away, like sounds heard underwater. She was alone with her dead husband in the middle of the desert, and nothing in her life had prepared her for this moment. Nothing could have. The stagecoach driver was still sitting on his bench, holding the reins with white knuckles. The merchant and the woman stood 20 feet away, not sure if they should run or stay, or what exactly was happening to their quiet journey west. Thomas pulled his bandana all the way off and stuffed it in his pocket. Without it, he looked younger somehow, more like the man she had married. But there were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard choices, lines that had not been there 3 years ago. "Sarah," he said again, and her name on his lips was like coming home and leaving home at the same time. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to hold him. She wanted to scream at the desert sky and ask why the world was so cruel as to give her back the thing she had learned to live without. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. Why? It was such a small word for such a big question. Why did you let me think you were dead? Why did you let me bury an empty coffin? Why did you let me learn to live without you? Why are you here, alive and robbing stagecoaches, when I've spent 3 years trying to figure out how to breathe without you? He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. How do you explain 3 years of lies in the space of a heartbeat? How do you make someone understand why you became a ghost when staying alive was too hard? The sun was starting to sink toward the western hills, painting the desert the color of old blood. Soon it would be dark, and the desert at night was no place for stagecoaches or passengers or questions that had no good answers. But Sarah Mitchell stood there in the fading light, looking at her dead husband's living face, and realized that some questions cannot wait for better timing. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled tight, ready to snap. Thomas stood with his hat in his hands now, the way he used to stand in church when the preacher talked about sin. His gun hung loose in its holster, forgotten. Sarah noticed that his hands were shaking. "Get back in the coach," the driver called from his seat. His voice was high and tight. "We need to move before dark." But Sarah could not move, could not think past the impossible fact of Thomas standing there, breathing and real and wrong in every way that mattered. She had learned to live with his death. She did not know how to live with his resurrection. "Sarah," Thomas said, stepping closer. She could smell him now, leather and dust and something else. Something sharp and bitter that she did not recognize. "I know what this looks like. What this looks like." The words came out harder than she meant them to. "What this looks like is my dead husband robbing stagecoaches. What this looks like is 3 years of grief for a man who was never in the ground." The merchant had edged closer to the coach, ready to climb back inside. The woman in perfume was praying again, but quieter now, as if she did not want to interrupt whatever was happening between the dead man and his. Thomas looked at the passengers, then back at Sarah. She could see him calculating, deciding how much truth he could tell in front of strangers, how much of a shame he could bear to have witnesses for. "We can't talk here," he said. "Not like this." "Then where?" Sarah's voice broke on the words. "Your grave? Should we talk at your grave, Thomas?" "Because that's where I've been talking to you for 3 years. He flinched like she had slapped him. Good. She wanted him to hurt. She wanted him to understand what he had done to her, what his death had cost, even if it was not a real death. Especially because it was not a real death. "I had reasons," he said, and his voice was so quiet she had a strain to hear it. "Good reasons." "There is no good reason for this," Sarah said, and she felt tears starting in her eyes. She wiped them away with the back of her hand. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of him. There is no good reason for letting someone think you're dead when you're not. The sun was sinking faster now, painting the rocks around them red and gold. Desert shadows were long and dark, full of places where a man could hide or disappear. Thomas kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected someone to come riding over the hills. "I owed money," he said suddenly, the words coming out a rush. "A lot of money. To men who don't forgive debts." Sarah stared at him. "What kind of money?" Thomas looked at the ground, at his boots, at anything but her face. "Gambling money." The word hit her like a physical blow. Gambling. She had known Thomas liked to play cards with the men from the mine, liked to bet on horse races and boxing matches. But she had thought it was harmless. A few dollars here and there. Not serious money. Not the kind of money that could make a man fake his own death. "How much?" she asked. "Enough to lose the farm," he said. "Enough to lose everything we had. Enough to put you in danger." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Their farm had been small but good. Rich soil, clean water, room for the children they had planned to have someday. She had loved that place almost as much as she had loved Thomas. Almost. "So you died instead," she said. "I staged the mine accident," Thomas said, and each word seemed to cost him something. "Made it look like I was trapped under the rocks. The other men, they tried to dig me out, but I was already gone. Already running. Running where?" Thomas gestured at the empty desert around them. "Everywhere. Nowhere. Trying to stay ahead of the men I owed. Try to figure out how to pay them back without getting you killed in the process." The stagecoach driver cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we really need to go. It's not safe to be out here after dark." Sarah looked at him, then at the other passengers. They were watching her with the careful attention of people who were trying not to stare. This was her life, broken open like an egg in front of strangers. Her private grief turned into a public spectacle. "Go," she said to them. "Leave us." "Sarah," the woman started. "Go," Sarah said again, and there was something in her voice that made them move. The merchant climbed into the coach. The woman followed. The driver gathered his reins and looked down at Sarah one more time. "You sure about this, ma'am? It's a long walk to anywhere from here." Sarah looked at Thomas, at his familiar face made strange by 3 years of lies. "I'm sure." The coach lurched into motion, wheels spinning in the sand. Sarah watched it disappear over a low hill, carrying with it her bag and her plans and her carefully constructed new life. Now she was alone with her ghost of a husband in a desert that stretched to the edge of the world. "You let them think I was a widow," she said when the sound of the coach had faded completely. "You were better off without me," Thomas said. "Safer. That wasn't your choice to make." Thomas took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. It was a gesture she remembered, something he did when he was wrestling with a problem too big to solve. "They would have come after you, Sarah. The men I owed. They would have burned the farm and worse to get to me. So you became an outlaw instead." Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. Seemed like the only choice I had left. Dead men don't owe debts, but they also don't eat. Don't have places to sleep. Don't have any way to make an honest living. Sarah looked at his clothes, his horse, his gun. All of it looked expensive. Too expensive for a dead man with no money. "How much have you stolen?" "Enough," he said, and his voice was flat. "Not enough. It doesn't matter how much I take. There's always more I owe. Interest, they call it. Money growing like weeds." The desert was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the rocks. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, and another answered. Soon it would be full dark, and the desert would come alive with things that hunted in the shadows. "I wrote you letters," Thomas said suddenly. Sarah looked at him. "I never got any letters. I never sent them. But I wrote them. Every week for 3 years. Telling you where I was, what I was doing. Telling you I was sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring back 3 years," Sarah said. "I know. Sorry doesn't heal a broken heart. I know. Sorry doesn't make this right." Thomas looked at her, and in his eyes she could see all the nights he had spent alone, all the mornings he had woken up knowing he had chosen to be dead to the only person who had ever really loved him. "I thought about coming back," he said. "Every day I thought about it. But every day the debt got bigger and the danger got worse, and coming back would have meant putting you in the middle of it." Sarah felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart, that had broken 3 years ago. Something else. Some wall she had built to keep herself safe from hoping for impossible things. "I grieved you," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I wore black for a year. I sold the farm because I couldn't bear to be there without you. I learned to sleep alone and eat alone and wake up alone. I learned to live without you, Thomas. And it almost killed me." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the individual lines around his eyes, the small scar on his chin where he had cut himself shaving years ago. Close enough to touch, if she wanted to, if she could figure out how to want anything anymore. "I'm sorry," he said again. "Stop saying that. What else is there to say?" Sarah looked at him. This man who had been her husband and her ghost, and now was something else entirely. Something she had no name for. "Tell me about the letters." Thomas blinked. "What?" "The letters you wrote, but never sent. Tell me about them." For the first time since his bandana had blown away, Thomas almost smiled. "Almost. They're in my saddlebags. All of them. I carry them everywhere." "Why?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the desert that had become his home. "Because they're the only honest thing I've done in 3 years. The only place where I can still be the man you married instead of the man I became." The sun touched the horizon, and the whole sky caught fire. Red and orange and gold, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Sarah had always loved desert sunsets, loved the way they turned the whole world into something magical. But tonight the beauty felt like mockery. "Show me," she said. Thomas looked at her. "What?" "The letters." "Show me the letters." There was something in her voice, some note of possibility or hope or desperation, that made him move. He walked to his horse, a big bay that was better fed than its owner, and opened his saddlebags. From inside, he pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Letters. Hundreds of them, from the look of it, all addressed to her in Thomas's careful handwriting. All unsent, all carrying 3 years' worth of words that had been meant for her, but never made the journey. He held them out like an offering, like a man presenting evidence of his own broken heart. Sarah took the bundle, feeling its weight in her hands. These letters represented every week Thomas had been dead to her. Every Sunday, she had visited his empty grave. Every night, she had cried herself to sleep missing him. "I don't know if I can read them," she said. "You don't have to." But even as she said it, Sarah was untying the string that held them together. She was not sure if she was looking for forgiveness or punishment or just some way to understand how her life had gone so wrong. But she needed to know what Thomas had been thinking during the years he had let her believe he was gone forever. The first letter was dated 3 days after the mine accident, 3 days after his funeral, 3 days after she had stood in the rain and watched them lower an empty coffin into the ground. "My darling Sarah," it began, and seeing her name in his familiar handwriting made her chest tight. "I know I can never send this, but I had to write it anyway. Had to tell you that I am alive and thinking of you and dying a little more each day from missing you." She looked up at Thomas, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man waiting for judgment. "How many are there?" 156, he said without hesitation. "One for every week since I died." The sky was almost dark now, and the first stars were beginning to show. Soon it would be cold, the way deserts always were, but Sarah did not notice the temperature. She was holding 3 years of her dead husband's thoughts, and she did not know whether she wanted to read them all or burn them in a fire. Instead, she asked the question that had been growing in her heart since the moment she had seen his face. "What do you want from me, Thomas? Why didn't you just ride away when you saw it was me in the coach?" Thomas looked at her for a long time, and in his eyes she could see all the lonely nights and stolen dawns and desperate choices that had brought them to this moment. "Because," he said quietly, "dead or alive, I never stopped being your husband." Thomas's camp was hidden in a narrow canyon between 2 red rock walls that rose up like the ribs of some ancient beast. Sarah followed him there on his horse, sitting behind him the way she used to when they were young, and the world was simple and death was something that happened to other people. But now his body felt different against hers. Thinner, harder, like he had been carved down to just the essential parts of himself. The camp was not much. A bedroll spread on sandy ground, a small fire ring made of stones, a coffee pot that had seen better days. Everything a man needed to stay alive, but nothing that made living feel like more than just not dying. Thomas helped her down from the horse, his hands careful on her waist. She noticed that his fingers trembled slightly, and when he turned away to tend to his horse, she caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. Not fresh whiskey, old whiskey, the kind that lived in a man's blood and came out through his skin. "It's not much," he said, gesturing at the camp, "but it's hidden, safe." Sarah looked around at the rock walls that hemmed them in on 3 sides. It felt less like safety and more like a trap, a place where a man could hide from the world, but also where the world could forget about him entirely. "How long have you been living like this?" she asked. Thomas busied himself with unsaddling his horse. "Long enough. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." Sarah sat down on a flat rock near the cold fire ring. The desert night was settling around them now, bringing with it the kind of quiet that made every small sound seem loud. Her own breathing, Thomas's footsteps in the sand, the creak of leather as he pulled the saddle from his horse's back. She was still holding the bundle of letters, and they felt heavier now than they had in the desert. Heavier with possibility, with 3 years of words that had been meant for her but never received. She untied the string again and pulled out the top letter. Thomas glanced at her, then looked away quickly. "You don't have to read those now. Or ever, if you don't want to." But Sarah was already unfolding the first page. The paper was rough, the kind you could buy at any general store. The handwriting was Thomas's, but shakier than she remembered, less sure of itself. "My darling Sarah," the letter began. "Today I watched them bury an empty coffin with my name on it. Watched you stand in the rain with your black dress and your broken heart, and I wanted to run to you more than I have ever wanted anything in my life. But I stayed hidden in the rocks above the cemetery and let you think I was dead, because keeping you safe is more important than keeping myself alive." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She could remember that day perfectly. The rain that had turned the cemetery into a bog of mud. The way the preacher's words had been swallowed by the wind. The terrible finality of dirt hitting wood, even though there was no body beneath the coffin. She had stood there until everyone else had gone home, stood there until the gravediggers finished their work and packed their tools away. Stood there until the rain had soaked through her black dress, and she was shivering so hard she could barely walk. And all that time, Thomas had been watching from the rocks above, alive and close enough to touch. "You were there," she said, not looking up from the letter. Thomas had started a small fire, and the flames cast moving shadows on the canyon walls. "I had to see, had to know that people believed I was really gone. You watched me cry over an empty grave. Yes, you watched me try to throw dirt on your coffin and fall to my knees instead. Yes, you watched me break apart, and you did nothing." Thomas was quiet for a long time, feeding small sticks to the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "I died a little that day too, Sarah, watching you hurt because of me, knowing I was the one who put that pain in you. But if I had gone to you then, if I had told you the truth, the men I owed would have found us both. And they would have done worse things to you than grief ever could." Sarah folded the letter and set it aside, then pulled out another one. This one was dated a month later. "My darling Sarah, I saw you in town today. You were buying flour at Henderson's store, and you looked so thin and tired that I almost forgot every reason I have for staying dead. Mrs. Henderson was kind to you, put an extra scoop of flour in your bag, and wouldn't take money for it. That's when I knew the whole town was taking care of you the way I should have been, the way I can't be anymore. You were watching me," Sarah said. "All that time you were there. Not all the time. But sometimes I had to know you were all right. I wasn't all right." Thomas poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the dark sky. "I know." Sarah read another letter. Then another. Each one was a window into the life Thomas had been living while she thought he was dead. The towns he had drifted through. The jobs he had tried to take before his fake death caught up with him. The slow slide from desperate man to outlaw. In one letter, he wrote about the first stagecoach he had robbed. How his hands had shaken so badly he could barely hold his gun. How he had vomited afterward, behind a rock where no one could see. How he had cried that night, knowing he had become the kind of man his father would have been ashamed of. In another, he wrote about a woman in a town called Red Creek who had reminded him of Sarah. Same color hair, same way of holding her head when she was thinking. He had followed her for 3 blocks before coming to his senses and riding out of town that same night. Each letter was a small confession, a piece of the guilt he had been carrying for 3 years. By the time Sarah had read a dozen of them, she could see the shape of Thomas's exile. Not just from home, but from himself, from the man he had been when she married him. "You've been drunk," she said, looking up from a letter dated 6 months ago. Thomas was still poking at the fire. "Sometimes, this letter, you can barely write straight. The words run together. It was a bad night. How many bad nights have there been?" Thomas finally looked at her, and in the firelight, she could see how much older he looked than his years. "Too many." Sarah set the letters aside and really looked at him. At his hollow cheeks and the way his shirt hung loose on his frame. At the slight tremor in his hands that never quite stopped. At the careful way he held himself, like a man who was always ready to run or fight or disappear. "You're killing yourself," she said, slowly. "Is that what you want?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to go home. I want to wake up in our bed with you beside me and have the biggest problem in my life be whether the corn will be ready for harvest. I want to sit on our porch in the evening and listen to you read while I whittle something useless. I want to go to church on Sunday and hold your hand during the hymns. I want to be the man you married instead of the man I became. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks between them. Sarah watched the sparks rise and fade, each one bright for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. "But you can't go back," she said. "No, I can't go back. And you can't stay here." Thomas looked around at his meager camp, at the rock walls that had become his world. "This isn't living," he said. "It's just not dying." Sarah stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight, where the darkness began. Out there, beyond the reach of the flames, the desert stretched away in all directions. Endless. Empty. Full of places where a person could disappear forever. "The farm is gone," she said. "I sold it 2 years ago. Used the money to move to Phoenix, then to Flagstaff. Been moving ever since, trying to find a place where I could stop feeling like half of me was missing. I am sorry." "Stop saying that. What else is there to say?" Sarah turned back to face him. "Tell me what you want me to do. Now. Tonight. Do you want me to pretend I never saw you? Do you want me to ride away in the morning and forget this happened? Or do you want me to help you figure out how to stop her?" Thomas looked at her like she had just asked him to explain the movement of stars. "Help me. The men you owe money to. Are they still looking for you? Every day. How much do you still owe?" Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "More than I can ever steal. More than I can ever pay. The debt grows faster than I can chip away at it." "What if it didn't?" "What do you mean?" Sarah walked back to the fire and sat down across from Thomas. "What if there was a way to pay it all at once? What if there's a way to make this right?" Thomas stared at her. "There isn't enough money in the world, Sarah. Maybe not in the world, but maybe in a bank." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas understood what she was suggesting, and the understanding made him go very still. "No," he said. "Why not?" "Because that's not who you are. That's not who we are." Sarah picked up another letter, one from near the bottom of the pile. This one was newer, dated just a few weeks ago. The handwriting was steadier, but the words were darker. "I'm tired," he had written. "Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being dead to the only person I've ever loved. Sometimes I think it would be better if I really was in the ground." She read that part aloud, watching Thomas's face as the words hit him. "I was having a dark night," he said. "How many dark nights have there been lately?" Thomas didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Sarah could see the truth in his face, in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "You're gonna die out here," she said. "Maybe from a bullet, maybe from whiskey, maybe from just giving up. But you're going to die, and it's going to be for nothing. Better me than you. That's not your choice to make anymore." Sarah leaned forward, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in Thomas's blue eyes. The same eyes she had fallen in love with when she was 18 and believed that love could conquer anything. "I'm not the girl you married, Thomas. That girl died in the cemetery 3 years ago. I'm someone else now. Someone harder. Someone who has learned to live with impossible things." Thomas reached across the fire and touched her hand. His fingers were warm and familiar and wrong at the same time. "What are you saying?" Sarah looked down at their joined hands, at the wedding ring she still wore even though she had buried her husband, at the calluses on Thomas's fingers that spoke of hard work and harder choices. "I'm saying that maybe it's time to stop running," she said. "Maybe it's time to finish this, one way or another." The fire was burning lower now, and the shadows were growing deeper. Soon they would need to add more wood or let the flames die completely. Soon they would need to decide whether they were going to try to sleep in the same camp or whether the ghosts between them were too large to ignore. But for now, they sat in the flickering light, holding hands across the fire, two people who had loved each other and lost each other and found each other again in the most impossible way. Two people trying to figure out whether love was strong enough to survive the weight of 3 years' worth of lies. "There's something else," Thomas said quietly. Sarah waited. "Timony Uva. They're not just any men. They're the Garrett brothers. You remember them?" Sarah's blood went cold. Everyone in the territory knew the Garrett brothers. 3 men who ran gambling and lending operations from Tucson to Santa Fe. Men who collected debts with bullets when words didn't work. Men who had burned down entire homesteads for less than what Thomas owed them. Jesus, Thomas. They put a price on my head 2 years ago. Dead or alive, but they prefer alive. They want to make an example of me. Sarah understood now why Thomas had chosen to disappear completely. Why he had let her think he was dead rather than risk having the Garrett brothers learn about her. They would have used her to get to him, and they would not have been gentle about it. "How much is the bounty?" she asked. $500. It was more money than most people in the territory saw in a year. Enough to make every drifter and gun hand within 100 miles start looking for Thomas Mitchell. "So you can never stop running," Sarah said. "Never." They sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle and the distant sound of wind moving through the rocks. Sarah thought about the life she had been building in Tucson. The small house, the job she had lined up teaching school, the quiet, safe existence she had planned for herself. All of it seemed very far away now. "I have an idea," she said finally. Thomas looked at her. "But you're not going to like it." They left the canyon at first light, when the desert was still cool and the sky was the color of old silver. Thomas rode his bay horse, and Sarah rode behind him again, her arms around his waist, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. It reminded her of the early days of their marriage, when they would ride out together to check the boundaries of their small farm, when the future stretched ahead of them like an unbroken road. Now the road was broken in so many places that Sarah could not see how to put the pieces back together. But she was going to try. They were riding toward Millfield, a town 3 days north where Thomas had never robbed anyone and where the sheriff was known to be a fair man. A town where Thomas could turn himself in without getting shot on sight. A town where they might have a chance of making things right, even if right looked nothing like what they had planned. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said for the 10th time since they had broken camp. "We've been over this," Sarah replied, her voice steady against his back. "The bounty hunters will still come. Even if I'm in jail, they'll still come. Let them come." Thomas was quiet for a while, but Sarah could feel the tension in his shoulders. "Sarah, you don't understand what these men are like. The Garrett brothers, they don't forget debts. They don't forgive them either. Then we'll have to make sure the debt gets paid." They had talked about this through most of the night, sitting by the dying fire while the desert grew cold around them. Sarah's plan was simple and terrible, and probably the only chance they had. Thomas would turn himself in to the sheriff in Millfield. He would confess to every robbery he had committed, every law he had broken, and Sarah would use the reward money from his capture to pay off his debt to the Garrett brothers. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan that ended with both of them alive. $500 won't be enough," Thomas said. "I owe them more than $3,000 now, with interest. Then we'll find the rest." Ow! Sarah had been thinking about that too. "The farm I sold. I've got some of that money left. Not much, but some. And there are other things. My mother's jewelry. The silver brush. Whatever it takes. I can't let you do that. You can't stop me." Thomas pulled the horse to a halt and twisted around to look at her. "Sarah, listen to me. Even if we pay them everything, even if we give them every penny they're owed, there's no guarantee they'll let me live. Men like the Garretts, they don't just want their money back. They want blood. They want everyone to know what happens when you cross them." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "Then at least you'll die as Thomas Mitchell instead of some nameless outlaw. At least you'll die as my husband." The words hung between them in the morning air. Thomas searched her face, looking for doubt or fear or some sign that she didn't understand what she was asking of him. But Sarah had spent 3 years learning to live with the impossible. She had learned to be stronger than she ever thought she could be. "Why?" Thomas asked finally. "After everything I've done to you, why would you risk this?" Sarah looked out at the desert around them, at the red rocks and endless sky and the road that stretched ahead toward an uncertain future. "Because I took a vow once. In sickness and in health, for better or worse. Till death do us part. And you're not dead, Thomas." "Not yet." Thomas turned back around and urged the horse forward again. But Sarah could feel something change in him, some loosening of the tight coil of despair he had been carrying. It was not hope, not yet, but it was something close to it. They rode in silence for a long time, climbing out of the desert toward the higher country, where Millfield sat nestled between two low hills. The landscape changed gradually around them. Less sand, more grass. Trees appeared, scattered at first, then growing thicker as they gained elevation. It was beautiful country, and Sarah found herself remembering why she had fallen in love with the West in the first place. The way the light fell across the mountains in the morning. The vastness of the sky. The sense that anything was possible if you were brave enough to reach for it. "Do you remember," Thomas said suddenly, "the first time we rode out here together? When we were looking at land to buy." Sarah smiled against his back. "You fell off your horse trying to impress me. I was reaching for that apple blossom. You said you'd never seen one before. And you said you'd get me one if it was the last thing you did. Nearly was." They both laughed, and for a moment it was like the old days. Like they were young again, and the world was full of possibilities instead of problems. But the moment didn't last. It couldn't last. There was too much broken between them for laughter to fix. "I'm scared," Thomas said quietly. "Me too. What if this doesn't work?" Sarah tightened her arms around his waist. "Then at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have been together at the end." They stopped for lunch beside a stream that ran clear and cold between stands of cottonwood trees. Thomas watered the horse while Sarah unpacked the small amount of food they had brought with them. Hardtack and jerky and coffee that Thomas had somehow managed to keep good despite his rough living. They ate without talking much, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Sarah watched Thomas's hands as he ate, noticed how careful he was with every bite, as if he wasn't sure when he might eat again. It reminded her of how thin he had gotten, how much the last 3 years had cost him. "When was the last time you had a real meal?" she asked. Thomas considered this. Define real. Something that didn't come from a can or a saddlebag. Something cooked in a real kitchen. "I can't remember." Sarah felt her heart squeeze. "When we get to Millfield, before you turn yourself in, I'm going to buy you the biggest steak they have." "Sarah, don't argue with me about this. If we're doing this thing, we're doing it right. One last meal together before." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Before they took him to jail. Before the bounty hunters came. Before whatever was going to happen happened. Thomas reached over and took her hand. "One last meal," he agreed. They finished eating and packed up their small camp. The sun was getting higher now, and the day was warming up. By evening they would be in Millfield, and by morning Thomas would be in custody. The thought should have terrified Sarah, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. A sense of purpose. A feeling that she was finally moving towards something instead of just running away. "Tell me about the letters again," she said as they rode. "What about them?" "The ones you never sent. What did you write about?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Everything. Nothing. What I had for breakfast. What the weather was like. How much I missed the sound of your voice." "Did you write about me?" "Every single one." "What did you say?" Thomas's voice got soft, the way it used to when he told her he loved her in the dark before dawn. "I wrote about the way you hummed while you cooked breakfast. The way you always read the same page twice when you were tired. The way you laughed at your own jokes before you told them to me. The way you looked in the morning light coming through our bedroom window." Sarah felt tears starting in her eyes. "I stopped doing those things. After you died, I stopped humming. Stopped reading. Stopped laughing. I know. I wrote about that too. About how I had taken away all the things that made you happy and how I would give anything to see you smile again." "I'm trying to remember how," Sarah said. "To be happy, I mean. It's harder than I thought it would be." "We'll figure it out," Thomas said. Together. The road to Millfield wound through a valley between 2 ranges of hills. Following the course of the stream, they had eaten lunch beside. It was good country for farming, Sarah noticed. Rich soil, plenty of water, protection from the worst of the desert. The kind of place where a man could build a life, if he had the chance. They passed other travelers on the road. A family in a wagon, heading west toward California. A group of miners, heading back east with empty pockets and disappointed faces. A preacher on a tired-looking mule, carrying his Bible in his saddlebag and his hope in his heart. None of them paid much attention to Thomas and Sarah. Just another couple traveling together, probably husband and wife, by the easy way they rode. If any of them recognized Thomas from wanted posters, they didn't show it. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills, the town of Millfield appeared ahead of them. It was bigger than Sarah had expected, built around a crossroads where two major trails met. There were maybe 50 buildings, including a hotel, a bank, 3 saloons, and a sheriff's office with a jail attached to the back. Thomas reined in the horse at the edge of town, and they sat for a moment looking at the buildings and the people moving between them. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that their quiet town was about to become part of a story that would be told in saloons and around campfires for years to come. "Last chance," Thomas said. "We can still ride away. Find another town, another plan." Sarah looked at the sheriff's office, at the light glowing in the windows as evening approached. "No, this is right. This is what we're going to do." They rode into town slowly, like people who had nothing to hide. They left the horse at the livery stable and walked to the hotel, where Sarah paid for a room with some of the money she had saved from selling the farm. The clerk looked at them curiously, but didn't ask questions. In a frontier town, you learn not to ask too many questions about strangers. The room was small and clean, with a bed and a wash basin and a window that looked out on the main street. Sarah set her small bag on the bed and looked around. It was the first time she had been alone with Thomas in 3 years, the first time they had stood together in a room that belonged to them, even temporarily. "I'll sleep on the floor," Thomas said. Sarah looked at him. "We were married for 4 years, Thomas. I think we can manage to share a bed for one night." Thomas nodded, but she could see the uncertainty in his face. They were married, yes, but they were also strangers. 3 years was a long time to be dead to someone. Long enough for everything to change. "Are you hungry?" Sarah asked. "That steak I promised you." Thomas smiled, and for the first time since she had seen his face in the desert, the smile reached his eyes. "I could eat." They went downstairs to the hotel restaurant, where Sarah ordered 2 steaks and a bottle of wine and told the waiter to bring them the best of everything. Thomas protested that it was too expensive, but Sarah silenced him with a look. If this was their last night together, she was going to make it count. The food was good, better than either of them had eaten in a long time. The wine was better. They talked about small things, the weather, the town, the people at the other tables. They did not talk about tomorrow. They did not talk about what would happen when morning came. But as the evening wore on, the weight of the unsaid things grew heavier between them. Finally, Sarah could not stand it anymore. "I forgive you," she said suddenly. Thomas looked up from his plate. "What?" "For the gambling. For the debts. For letting me think you were dead. For all of it. I forgive you." Thomas set down his fork and stared at her. "Sarah, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. If we're going to do this, if we're going to try to build something from the wreckage we've made, then I need you to know that. I forgive you, and I love you, and whatever happens tomorrow, we're going to face it together." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. His eyes were bright with tears he was trying not to shed. "I love you too. I never stopped loving you, not for one day in 3 years." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, holding hands across the table like they used to do when they were young and foolish and believed that love could conquer anything. Maybe it couldn't conquer everything. Maybe there were some problems too big for love to solve. But love could give you the strength to face those problems head on, and sometimes that was enough. After dinner, they walked back to their room and got ready for bed. Sarah had bought Thomas a new shirt and a bar of soap at the general store, and he washed and shaved and made himself presentable. She had almost forgotten how handsome he was when he was clean, how the sight of him could still make her heart race after all these years. They lay in bed together, not touching but close enough to hear each other breathe. Outside, the town was settling down for the night. Dogs barked. A piano played somewhere in one of the saloons. A night watchman walked past their window, his footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk. "Sarah," Thomas said in the darkness. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For being stronger than I was." for being willing to walk through hell to get us both home. Sarah rolled over to face him, and in the dim light from the street, she could see his face on the pillow beside her. "We're not home yet." "No, but we're closer than we've been in a long time." Sarah reached out and touched his face, traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these 3 years haven't been for nothing. Losing you taught me things about myself I never would have learned otherwise. Taught me that I'm stronger than I thought, braver than I thought, more capable of surviving impossible things than I ever imagined. I'm sorry you had to learn those things." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "I'm not. I am grateful. Because now I know that whatever tomorrow brings, I can handle it. We can handle it." Thomas turned toward her and pulled her close, and for the first time in 3 years, Sarah fell asleep in her husband's arms. Outside, the town slept peacefully, unaware that morning would bring a reckoning that had been building for 3 long years. When dawn came, painting the sky the color of hope and regret, Sarah and Thomas Mitchell got dressed and walked hand in hand to the sheriff's office. The sun was just breaking over the eastern hills, and the air was cool and clean and full of possibility. Thomas squeezed her hand one last time, then knocked on the door. "Sheriff," he called, "my name is Thomas Mitchell, and I'd like to turn myself in." The door opened, and the rest of their story began.